You guys good?
Singapore Home Brew on Money FM 89.3.
In our Singapore Home Brew segment, we take a look at the rich maritime history and art and culture of Nusantara, which is an interconnected region shaped by centuries of trade and migration and creativity. Joining us today are two guests who will talk about Singapore's role in that incredibly rich, layered story. First, we have Wang, the founder of Noor's Nusantara podcast. It's a new series that looks at Singapore's past through the maritime Southeast Asia's culture and art, as we mentioned before, and with her deep experience in museum curation and visual storytelling as well. And Richard Hassell, co-founder of WOHA Architects. Richard has spent decades exploring the artistic and architectural memory of Nusantara, looking at his close work with communities, particularly in Bali and elsewhere. That was a big lead-in, but welcome to you both, Noor, and to Richard.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Glenn and Neil, for having us.
Great to have you on the show. Noor, let's start with you. Give us an overview of Nusantara. What was it? What is it? Tell us about it.
Yeah. So Noor's Nusantara is a first of its kind podcast that looks at Singapore from a fresh perspective, essentially through the maritime Southeast Asian visual cultures, which I refer to as Nusantara. So we're looking at it cross-disciplinarily through art, archaeology, architecture, and also introducing perspectives from law and history as well. And what it aims to do is possibly attempt to sort of bridge this gap, especially in public discussion or cultural discussion about Singapore that has been predominantly, land-centric, or looking at it through modernity, and really to relook at Singapore, reframe Singapore, reimagine Singapore through this deep cultural connection that we have with maritime Southeast Asia, which has long nourished the space and also is an antecedent to many port entrepôts in the region.
For our listeners, can you just tell us what Nusantara actually is, what it means, what it represents?
Yeah. So Nusantara is a Javanese term. It's composed of two operating words. Nusa means island and Antara means in between. So we are the islands in between, where Singapore is part of, and it is the world's largest archipelago. And more broadly, we are also part of the larger Austronesian region that stretches from the Pacific Ocean right to the Indian Ocean. So you can imagine lots of cultural interactions happening through the movements of peoples, goods, and ideas.
Awesome. Richard, you're an architectural expert. You've been looking at this idea of Nusantara as it relates to art and architectural projects that you've worked on. How does that play into this idea of Nusantara? Obviously, we know there's specific architecture in this part of the world. What have you observed?
I have to sort of qualify, I'm not an expert on Nusantara, but as someone who practices across the region inadvertently, I've been engaging with Nusantara in our projects, and as an architect we're very project based, so I tend to drill down very deep around a particular place, look at culture and history around that place, and so through that, like if we're working in Bali, it just becomes really interesting to look at the deep history of the place, the cultural flows, and see how to express that in a contemporary way, which makes, or we're trying to evoke a connection or an emotional connection to place through developing these ideas of deep histories. And
what are some of the characteristics of that architecture, that art that you've seen?
I think it's just
that we would recognize, for example.
I mean, Balinese architecture, I think, is something that many people are familiar with, but maybe not so many people are familiar with it being part of the Majapahit Empire, which was an Indian empire which spread across the region. So Bali is Hindu because it's a religious legacy of that empire. But it's quite fascinating to see how Buddhism and Hinduism spread through the region, but there's older animist religions and rituals beneath that. and these often find expression in the material culture, so in the building or in the art or in the like in the Balinese offerings, for instance, very ancient, that predate all of these major world religions.
Yeah.
No, what I love about what you're doing, and Richard touched on it there, is focusing on Nusantara. It doesn't represent Singapore as this isolated port city that we sometimes have that slightly outdated view of Singapore. You know, island nation on its own, Raffles turns up, transforms everything, then Lee Kuan Yew takes over. We know that narrative. But what I like about what you're doing is you frame it in a more broader context, that Singapore is a part of this broader Nusantara. Could you explain that Singapore's role in that, whether it's through maritime trading, just to give us a greater sense that we've always been part of this community, this region, long before 1819?
Yeah, thank you, Neil. That's a great question. So indeed, I think one of the key narratives that is recurring from this podcast is we're looking at a lesser known narrative of Singapore, which, you know, is not really propagated by, say, the tourism brochures or the touristic narratives. And perhaps I could also start very early. I mean, because the podcast, the conversations are anchored around visual markers. So, for example, through archaeology, we could see the antecedents of Singapore, say in Bujang Valley, which is quite close to Penang, has a very sophisticated Indian Hindu-Buddhist civilization, and that is shown through the archaeological findings. And then there's the Korat Plateau, which is a Buddhist landscape in Thailand, and that's from the 7th century. And right in our backyard here, we have Borobudur and Prabanan from the 8th century. And what it shows is that, you know, this region has a long tradition of trade and exchange. And from these monumental archaeological monuments, you can tell there was it required a great deal of resourcing and coordination. So definitely the polities here were rather sophisticated to deal with that.
So you're saying these networks, these communities were communicating, were exchanging goods and ideas
Absolutely.
Long time ago.
Yes,
Yeah.
and these archaeological remnants are evidence of that. And we also have beautiful projections of the region. For example, the Indic or Sanskrit expression we were referred to as Suvarna Bhumi, which is land of gold. And it speaks of the traders and also the literati projection of this region, looking at this space for its spiritual and material potency. I mean, if we were to talk much earlier from like colonial or modern narratives.
And what time period would this be that you're talking about?
This would be, since the Bujang Valley Hindu-Buddhist findings were discovered in the 2nd century, it could be as early as that. So we're not a phenomena of the 19th century. It does show that Singapore in this region has a long tradition of trade dating back almost a millennia ago.
Sure.
So you're going way back past the 700-year narrative,
Indeed.
which seems to be when our history really takes off with the 5 Malay kings. You're saying it goes way before that. Our connections with the region.
Our connections, indeed.
Yeah, fascinating.
It's interesting, and as Neil just mentioned, that that to me is probably the most interesting part of Singapore's story is the 700 years of history, largely based around Fort Canning and elsewhere. That until recent years or recent decade or so has really not been talked about much. It's always been about Raffles and Farquhar and that and I feel like when you look at what happened at Borobudur and Prambanan, and you look at what was going on at Angkor Wat over millennia there, you have to imagine that as people were traveling back and forth and warring back and forth in Thailand and elsewhere, they had to have come through Singapore.
Absolutely.
For fresh water, for whatever, right, for supplies, and this idea that Singapore has been at the center of a lot of things for a long time, like you say, better part of a millennia. Like telling that story, I think, is super interesting, first of all, but also very important for Singapore to have a sense of itself.
Indeed.
How do you touch upon that?
So that is why I've been very privileged to have podcast speakers like Richard Hassell.
Because you have a variety of guests who
I
come
do,
on. Yeah.
I do.
Yeah.
And in a way, having Richard really embodies the spirit of the podcast because he comes from an architectural background, an artistic practice that is inspired, of course, by tropical materiality and culture. And also knowing of Richard's deep knowledge of Singapore's history, and your family's history also somewhat entwined in it. And that is where we want to extrapolate these voices and show a little side of Singapore that's not much known.
What do those voices sound like to you, Richard, with your history? And maybe just give a brief background about your family history here.
Well, actually, I don't have a very deep history here, but my great-great-grandfather in Australia was a ship captain, so he was always sailing back and forward between Australia and London, and so always going through this region. So, but my dad's a bit of a family historian, so I was always interested in these stories, and they they seem kind of fascinating how mobile everybody was in the 19th century, where the family, they were trying things in Tahiti and Mauritius, and then like up stakes to Tasmania and then Western Australia. So it was certainly that century was like incredible shifts of people and resources and cultures around the world, as the East India Company and then the colonial project spread out, and that was where this project in Singapore that I did at Osborne House was really fascinating, because it did uncover these somehow as a house it was like a locus for everything that was going on in Singapore. It seemed to pass through the door of this house all the way up into current times, but particularly Charles Prinsep, who built the house, his son ended up as the protector of the Aborigines in Western Australia and wrote the Aborigines Act, and ended up in a town right next to my grandmother where she grew up. And so it was really odd sort of excavating the history of a particular house in Singapore, and then sort of finding my family hiding in all this connected research, looking back at me sort of through the past.
I'm interested in your architectural connections, because you're looking at Nusantara, as I understand it, from an architectural, artistic standpoint, and how the architecture is informed by the climate, by conditions, by the available materials you have. I'm just curious to know, do you see any similarities between architecture here in the past and architecture across the region in the past? Do you see connections between the different areas of Nusantara?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting the way the culture, the climate and cultures do impact the architecture, and how the architecture gets modified as it moves through Nusantara. So you can see, like there's a rich resource in timber, for instance. So in different cultures across Southeast Asia, you get different expressions of timber, but they have many things in common based on the ease of or the availability of the resource. So enormous bits of timber, then the air movement for the monsoon and the tropical rains and shelter. So, but they're modified from other cultures. So that, the Balinese architecture is a kind of Indian architecture modified for the tropics. The British, when they came through, took bungalows that were developed in Calcutta and then brought to Singapore, then adapted for the climate, and you can see that the sort of heavier structures become lighter, the walls become screens, the windows just become openings with overhangs. So.
Right. Now that's interesting. I can see obviously the colonial influence coming through the region, but with the indigenous communities, were there any overlaps? Were they aware of what other communities were building, or was it completely independent of one another? So they're using timber in this part of Nusantara and we're using it in Singapore. Did they see each other's building when they were trading? Did they share ideas about architecture, steal from each other?
Definitely. I think there's a sort of continuum of vernacular houses from Sumatra through Malaysia and then Borneo and then all the way to Papua New Guinea. There's sort of different forms of houses on stilts, atap, panels and roofs. So it's, but I think very interesting the way like a Toraja house is very different from a Nias house, which is very different from a Dayak longhouse. But they have, I think they're all in touch with each other for millennia and sharing technology and techniques, but also expressing them in unique ways for their particular religion or ancestor stories. So it's a really beautiful laboratory of innovation and cultural flows, I think.
Fascinating.
We're talking with Richard Hassell, co-founder of WOHA Architects, and Noor Wang, founder of Noor's Nusantara podcast. Noor, we just have time for one more question or so, but tell us about, as we look forward, the podcast is just launching, what will people be able to hear in coming episodes? What will they understand about Nusantara, or maybe learn more about Singapore's place in it?
So we have a diverse league of voices, as I mentioned, from art, architecture, archaeology, with perspectives from law and history. So you will get quite an interesting view of Singapore within this vast maritime region, beyond just the narratives that you constantly hear about. So, and what is amazing about this podcast is, as I mentioned, everything is anchored around visuals. So the conversations are usually centered around the visuals, where we will look at work of art, a piece of architecture or archaeology, and unpack the conversations that then tells the stories and also the characters and people behind it. So you might just find yourself in one of the stories.
I have one final obvious question that I probably should have asked at the beginning. We've talked about Nusantara throughout. What area does it encompass? Where does it start and end? I mean, I know it's known as a maritime region around Singapore, but what are the endpoints?
So it's usually referred to as the world's largest archipelago. So essentially, it stretches from the Malay Peninsula, coming down to the Java Sea, and extend itself right up to the South China Sea, where Philippines is.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay, fascinating.
So, roughly where the sort of Orang Laut people
Indeed.
were from, or
Yes, yes.
continue to be from. Yeah.
Which is one of the early communities here in Singapore, and they have quite a unique culture and sensibility. So, again, going back to the symbol of this watery world, I mean, these communities really took advantage of the flows of the water to for adaptation and mobility, and I think that presents itself a very interesting perspective on, say, resilience and sustainability, because a lot of the conversations are rather land centric, but here it kind of flips the script, and
I just have to say I love this, because when I first arrived in Singapore began in 1819. Then a few years ago we decided that Singapore began 700 years ago, and now we're deciding, as we should have done in the first place, that it actually goes back much further than that, and we need to go back even further to see our links to the region. I think this is fabulous.
It's great. Noor, where do they find the podcast?
Well, it's available on all major social platforms. It's on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, and it's on www.norsnusantara.com.
Great.
And it's free. It's free for and
Even better.
That's
yes,
the best
Singapore,
part.
Singaporeans always love a bargain, so that'll go down well.
And new episodes drops fortnightly.
Great.
Yeah.
Noor Wang and Richard Hassell, thanks for being with us today.
That's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
On Money FM.